So when I was first ordained about 35 years ago, not long after I was ordained, I led a day retreat here at the LBC, a fresh order member, and this man introduced himself to me right at the start of the day before we'd really started, and said, he'd travelled quite a long way to meet me. I think, this is before YouTube, he'd travelled a long way to meet me, and he wanted to ask me a question. So I said, "Oh, great." So his question was, "Are you the future Buddha?" And I said, "No." And then he said, quite strikingly, "Are you just saying that?" And I said, "No, I'm not just saying that. I am not the future Buddha." And then he went home. He didn't even... I said, "I'm afraid I'm not the future Buddha, but I am teaching a day of meditation." And no, he went home. It was the future Buddha or no one. So I thought I'd start with that little funny story, because Maitreya is my name is Maitreyabandhu, and Bandhu means brother. Maitreya is the future Buddha. Is usually talked about as the Buddha of the future. And the reason why, I got lots of reasons why I'm not the future Buddha, I can tell you. Anyway, let's not go there. Sometimes the other watch laughs just a little bit too loud. He knows me of old. Anyway, I will give you a list afterwards. But the sort of, as it were, kind of Buddhist reason, the metaphysical reason, is because you can't be the future Buddha until Buddhism has died out. Yeah? So Buddhism, to call it that, which is a Western term, there's no term in Buddhism that translates as Buddhism. It's usually translated as my dharma and discipline, my truth and my approach to the truth, is how the Buddha talked about it. That is always traditionally, Buddhist tradition, is something that is discovered again and again through endless time. Yeah. So in this world period, according to traditional Buddhism, Shakyamuni discovered how things really are and became how things really are, became human enlightenment, became a human enlightened, an unimaginable new kind of creature where he overcame in that experience birth and death. Sangharakshita, the founder of our movement, says the Buddha becomes a whole new species unto himself. Yeah? He discovers the truth of things and becomes the truth of things. We can't really imagine that. And then he communicates a dharma. In other words, he communicates his experience of how he got to be the Buddha. Yeah? And that attracts people, and people practice that dharma. And they have over all this time. And, according to tradition, eventually that tradition will die out. Yeah? That eventually Buddhism will die out. Buddhism has within itself an assumption that it will disappear and then be rediscovered again in some unimaginable future by the Buddha Maitreya, who's traditionally supposed to be a kindness Buddha as opposed to a wisdom Buddha, but hey, let's not go there. The technicalities, really. But you see that what's striking about that is this incredibly unusual phenomena of a world religion saying, and this world religion will fall apart. It'll degrade over time, and eventually it'll need to be rediscovered again by, in this case, a future Buddha. I find that very sort of salutary and interesting from all sorts of points of view. So I've been asked to talk about the future path, and you could say, well, the future path runs out. Eventually, I think probably what could happen, and I'll come on to other things in a moment, is that there may still be Buddhist texts and people talking about Buddhism, even possibly Buddhist scholars and all that sort of thing, but nobody will really have a sense of what it's pointing at. You can be a scholar of Buddhism for your whole life and not really understand Buddhism. Of course, you you can do, but it doesn't necessarily mean you will. The words of Buddhism are pointers to the nature of things. Yeah? And if you can imagine that there easily could be a time in history where nobody gets it anymore. It becomes a historical thing. There was a tradition started by this person, they taught this, and then that died out. Yeah? Nobody really sees what it means anymore. So the whole Buddhist vision is a remarkable vision in so many ways, it's too many to talk about. But one aspect of that vision is that Buddhism arises in the world, discovered by someone, and then that they teach a Dharma which attracts people. Those people gain enlightenment. But the sort of impetus of the Buddha's teaching gradually dies out. It's reinvigorated again by teachers throughout time, from Atisha to my own teacher, Sangharakshita. What you find again and again is teachers kind of arise and sort of reinvigorate the tradition for a bit. But, arguably the trend is downward, yeah? And then it disappears, and then somebody else rediscovers the path. It might even then not be called Buddhism, but it would be what we are trying to practice here in this room. Yeah? So from a future point of view, Buddhism assumes the end of Buddhism, and then its rediscovery by a wholly new figure who becomes a Buddha for the future. Yeah? So that's one way of thinking about the future path. And then, of course, another way of thinking about the future path is that have we actually got one? I've been, fortunately and unfortunately, listening to and reading a lot of books about the end of civilization. I've had to promise my friends not to talk about it because it brings down the tone. But I was particularly struck by a political scientist and ecologist called William Ophuls. He uses both names weirdly, but Patrick Ophuls, William Ophuls. He writes a lot about the end of civilization, and if any of you, I'm sure of you, lots of listening to YouTubes and all these podcasts and so on, and it's very commonly talked about now. What is usually Ophuls talked about it as a polycrisis, a problematique, which means that it's not that civilization is facing one or two discrete challenges. Sometimes this is talked about in terms of a polycrisis or a metacrisis. So it's not that modern civilization is facing challenges that we can solve, if you see what I mean. What you now have is what Ophuls calls a problematique, which is where all of these problems are networked together to solve one problem makes another problem worse. Yeah? And more thinkers and writers and philosophers are talking about this polycrisis or problematique. Yeah? I found Ophuls particularly convincing, actually. I'm not that, I wouldn't know, but I found his arguments very, very convincing and very, very sobering. So one of the simple points is that, you cannot use the earth ongoingly as either a mine or a rubbish dump. Yeah, you just can't keep doing that. You've got planetary boundaries, and it's frightening, isn't it, just to see, for me, to see how much rubbish we create. We think of our planet as somewhere endlessly that you can mine and endlessly that you can turn into a rubbish dump, and that can't carry on. His critique is that civilizations last between 700 and 800 years, and then they break down. That's true of all civilizations pretty much until now. So if you date our civilization from modern civilization, which is now a global civilization, if you date that back to the invention of the steam engine, I think in 1763, I guess. Anyone? Have you read that book? Then basically we are now coming to the end of this civilization, if you use that time scale. So Ophuls says it will get worse in the 20s, and it will get considerably worse in 2030 and from then on. Now this isn't just a sort of one thinker thinking about the end of civilization, it's more and more people are talking about this polycrisis, metacrisis, problematique. So that's a bit sobering. But personally, it really does feel at times, doesn't it, that we're entering last times. Who knows? But the usual rebuttal to this is that technology will save the day. But what people forget is that technology uses energy. It doesn't create energy. There's a sort of weird thing that you somehow think that technology, computing power and so on, is actually creating energy. Of course, it's using energy and using it more and more quickly. Yeah. So those are two visions already of the future. One is that Buddhism dies out. This is quite a cheery one, isn't it? The next one is that civilization will end. And the figures that I've heard bandied about is we need to go, for the planet to be sustainable, we need to go from about 8 billion to 2 billion, something like that, which will be terrifying. But that's a very real possibility now at the end of civilization, at least as we know it. And we're utterly unprepared for that. And it's not our fault. We've created a world which we now can't do without. Like his example is the car. He says that's the most disastrous invention ever, because think of all the fuel it uses and so on, but also the alloys, the metals that go into it, then all the roads, the infrastructure you have to put in. We couldn't imagine human life without a car now. But it's absolutely disastrous, the car. And electric cars make little to no difference. So, it's very, very sobering, and I think we should be sobered by that. But I've got a third way of talking about the future path, whilst I'm on this very particular run, is of course, so one vision of the future is a cosmological vision of Buddhism appearing and disappearing again, rediscovered by a future Buddha. Civilization facing probably its most terrifying crisis, probably fairly soon. But of course, we human beings find it I find it very difficult, and I'm sure you do. We find it very, very difficult to really think outside of ourselves. I do, and I'm sure you do. When we think about the future, really the person we're most concerned about quite naturally is ourselves. And of course, the one future that we all know we have is that we will die. That's the one thing that is certain. And it's the one thing that is most uncertain is when that will happen. And it's weird, isn't it? Because we can talk about it quite easily. People have death cafes and talk about death and so on. And yet we're sort of, it seems to me, almost designed not to take that fact in, that we will die. Not everyone has been like that, but it's very, very difficult to really face that fact, never mind these larger scale issues. So for us, the future that we're most sure of is our own death, an imminent death, and what that means about our life. When Sangharakshita, or the founder of this movement, was asked what happens when you die, he said, well, the Buddhist answer to this is, you'll soon find out. So the greatest statement of this knowledge of death is this late poem by Philip Larkin, great English poet, called Orbade. I'll just read the first bit of it, and won't even read it. I'll read some of the bit. This is called Orbade. He never publishes. He died before it was published. I work all day and get half drunk at night. Waking at 4 to soundless dark, I stare. In time, the curtain edges will grow light. Till then, I see what's really always there. Unresting death, a whole day nearer now, making all thought impossible, but how and where and when I shall myself die. Arid interrogation, yet the dread of dying and being dead flashes afresh to hold and horrify. It's a brilliant evocation of that moment, which I don't know whether you've had, I've certainly had, where you just wake up to it a bit, often in the middle of the night, and unresting death is a whole day nearer now. And you know what, if you're like me, you'll sort of promise yourself to experience things more deeply, experience things with that in mind, and then before you know it, you're not really. And that before you know it can be very soon. So if we're going to talk about a future path, we'd have to talk globally from the Buddhist point of view, cosmologically in the Buddhist point of view of the dying of Buddhism and the rediscovery of Buddhism by the future Buddha, Maitreya. Or we'd have to think, I think now, about the possibility of a sort of a collapse of civilization, at least as it's configured now. It just is unthinkable to be able to continue in this way. We can't keep on treating the planet as if there are no planetary boundaries. And we won't wake up to that until we're forced to, I think, and governments won't wake up to that. Because we're very, very deeply, all of us naturally, without being our fault, are very egocentric. And really what we focus on is our own death, possible death, and your response to that can just be to get as much pleasure as you possibly can, which doesn't work because the more pleasure that you have, the more inured you become to it, the more habituated you become to pleasure, so that you get what's called get onto this what's called a hedonic treadmill, where the more pleasure you get, the less pleasure you actually experience. Yeah. So we've got this sort of nest of crises in a way. So then the question becomes, okay, what do we do about that? I don't want to dwell on sort of the negatives too much, but I do think we need all of us to wake up to our situation in those ways much more deeply. I need to do that, and I would say that you do. But what do we do about that? Well, to me it seems, and certainly Buddhism would say, but to me it seems, that the only thing to do, the only real thing to do, because pleasure seeking is really quite pathetic in that context, in the context of your own personal death, and in the context of the horrors to come, never mind the horrors that are here. Because we forget we're just in this tiny bubble of where, I can run off and get excellent coffee in 10 different directions, and I can afford to do that without bombs dropping on me and without all sorts of horrors that are around us all the time. But we're kind of in this bubble away from that, aren't we? So pleasure seeking, just simply trying to get pleasure, seems to me to be inhuman, living on that basis. It's very tempting to. I seem to be getting into pleasure seeking in my old age. I've just come back from holiday. And it's nice to have pleasure. You want to pleasure as much as pleasure as possible. But it's not enough. It's not enough. It really isn't enough, is it? Tempting though it is. We need to live a truly human life, a genuinely human life. And that is what Buddhism is. It's the sort of the truly human life. That's really what it is. Except for this word human is problematic because we all think we know what the human is. We've got this idea that, human life. As if, we understand that bit, the human life bit, the truly human life. Yeah, that sounds quite good. But we don't really know what the human is. We don't know what we have. We don't do that negatively and positively. So when I was with my daughter once and somebody crashed into me, I was really shocked at how violent I felt immediately and how protective. I didn't know that was there in me, that kind of instinct to protect children. The moment before I wouldn't have known it was there. And similarly, and more importantly perhaps, in the Buddhist life you experience that there's much more to your experience than you could ever have guessed. Yeah? So when we say a truly human life, we don't mean a truly human secular life, which is basically a concept of humanity living in a kind of middle place, psychologically well-adjusted or sensible, not religious probably, etc., etc. In Buddhism, humanity stretches all the way to the Buddha himself. Even would suggest that really the Buddha is our own true nature in some way, although that can be misunderstood. So we even have this word human, and we kind of think we know what it means, but Buddhism's idea of what we mean by human is vast, absolutely vast, stretching out into into our depth, stretching out to others, and stretching up towards to the Buddha himself. Yeah? So when I say a truly human life and a genuine human life, it's a human life with that kind of vision. Otherwise, it's far too limited. The only way to respond fully, reasonably to the future path of the end of Buddhism, the end of civilization, and the end of our own life is to become a force of good in the world, is to become a new force in the world of goodness. Yeah? And that's what the Buddha is, that's what the Buddha represents, and that's what all Buddhists are trying to become in a painfully imperfect way. That's what we're all trying to become, I hope. And yeah, it's very imperfect. So I thought I'd talk simply about that, about that great sort of triad that, the sort of ancient Greeks and so on, which is truth, beauty and goodness. I think really to live a fully human life, we need to dedicate our lives to truth. I put it in this order: truth, goodness and beauty. Yeah. So to dedicate ourselves to truth, the first things that occurred to me about that is that children naturally tell the truth. In fact, children have to be taught sometimes not to tell the truth. So they're not supposed to say, "You've got a big nose." They're taught not to say that. Children have got innate sort of sense of the truth. And many children, and certainly I did, and many others have, is you have an innate sense, I think, that there is a truth, that life is for something, that there is meaning in life and value in life. And Buddhism would say that is innate. It's not, Buddhism doesn't give you meaning. It shows you that you've already got an instinct for it and that you want to live it out more and more. What Buddhism does is kind of draws it out of you to such a point that you live out of it more and more and become eventually a Buddha. Yeah. It's not like, it doesn't give you something that's separate from something that's not there now. It's just that instinct of you towards the truth, in the simple sense of children speaking the truth, but also in that much deeper sense of feeling that there is such a thing as truth, that truth, that's even what we're here for, is to live in and live from the truth. That's what Buddhism's trying to draw that out of you more and more and more, until that is who you are. And what's interesting about so many things are interesting about the Buddhist path, but what you feel as you practice the Buddhist path, strangely, is you become more and more yourself. You become less and less kind of homogeneous, less and less kind of abstracted. You can become more and more like yourself, and yet you feel more and more in tune with other people. Yeah. So I think we all have this deep sense, if at least we have had at times, that there is some kind of real truth, transcendental truth, some kind of real truth. Now, the important thing to remember about that truth is that it's sacred. This is at least how I've been thinking about it recently. And what sacred means is that it means an infinitely important, it's infinitely important. My words are failing me already. And it's beyond language. That's what sacred really means. It's something of great meaning and value, but which is beyond language. It's not some sort of idolatry that we've got into thinking that's what the sacred is, like idols and so on, and pictures of gods. The sacred is something that is directly experienceable, even livable from, but which you can never successfully communicate. You can communicate it, but you can't communicate it in a way that other people can't understand. So the sacred is that which you cannot say, and therefore that which you cannot sell, or buy or own. Yeah? One of the great features about modern life is that we're turning everything into a commodity, our emotions, our education, what we did on holiday. Everything is very, very easily commodified. Everything is for sale. Yeah. So the sacred is that which cannot be sold. By definition, cannot be sold, cannot be had for yourself. Yeah. So when people think, I've had this spiritual experience, it's only valid to the degree in which it's not had for yourself. Yeah. So the sacred is this sense of life is founded on something which is of ultimate value, but which you can never quite communicate, and which you can't sell or buy. It can't be commodified. And in our contemporary setting, that's more important than ever, that something that can't be commodified. I think probably the very fact that you're here on the urban retreat suggests you've had some sense of it. And you can have a sense of it in the positive sense of a glimpse of that truth, a glimpse of what I'm calling the sacred. I'm using that in a fairly specialised way, but a glimpse of the sacred. I've certainly had those glimpses when I was young and as an adult. I think as much the case is that your experience of its existence is by the sense of you don't have it, if you see what I mean. Very often, it's not that you have a glimpse of the sacred, you feel its absence. And I think many of us feel that painfully, the absence of some transcendent meaning, is to use that language, or integral meaning, some foundation to our life that our life can flourish from. Yeah? I think if we're honest with ourselves, we can feel that we've kind of mislaid it or just distracted ourselves from it. It's often only when something very bad happens to you, a parent dies, a lover leaves you, your work falls apart, that you're shocked back into feeling the loss of the sacred, if you see what I mean. I think our lives can feel so shallow, and the reason our lives feel so shallow is because weirdly we have a glimpse of the depth. Do you see what I mean? We wouldn't know our life was shallow without that glimpse. Even my poor old mother, I remember, she once said to me very late in her life, my life has just been so shallow. Which is very painful to hear, but also, do you see how you can't feel that if you don't have sense that there's a depth to be had? Yeah. So we need to cherish our glimpses of the depth, as it were, or the glimpses of truth, of transcendent truth. I think people have experiences of them through drugs, for instance, increasingly. Ayahuasca is a drug of the moment. I've never taken it. But, I had my own LSD experience, and I definitely had a touch of it then. Of course, it closes straight away afterwards, but many people will have experienced glimpses of it through drugs. Increasingly, there are people who've experienced it through near-death experiences. Interestingly, sports people often experience it. I didn't realise this, but apparently, like footballers, they when they get them off camera, they start to talk in ways that feel much more religious, apparently, where they seem to know at certain moments where everyone is on the field and what everyone's doing. They sort of almost discover this new kind of mind. Yeah, they sort of have religious experiences. People playing music quite often will have religious experiences, but we're very nervous about them because we've all decided we're not religious. We might be spiritual. I'd like to say nowadays that I'm more religious, but I'm not really spiritual. So we need that vision of truth, yeah? And we need to keep coming. My own teacher, Sangharakshita, says that you find the truth and then you live by it. Yeah, you find the truth, then live by it. That's really what Buddhism is. Find the truth, then you live by it. Yeah? And you live by it more and more and more and more deeply and more frequently until your life is a living in the truth. And you see how that gives rise to a new kind of goodness. So there's, this is truth, goodness, beauty. So the philosopher that I was very interested in at one point was Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher. And his great contribution was to point out, really early on, I can't remember when, 18 something, that belief in a Christian God is no longer believable, is how he put it, which I think is a brilliant way of putting it. He didn't say, he did say God was dead, but that was a more rhetorical way of putting it. The best way of putting it is you just can't do that anymore. And what he meant is that the metaphor of God, that we could believe in God and the host of angels and so on, that we just can't do that anymore. Even if you think you can, you kind of can't. That's what he's basically saying. That's my gloss on it anyway. It's a bit like, it would be lovely to re-exhume the language of thee and thou. It's a very beautiful, much better way of talking than I and you. What would thou like? It's beautiful. It's actually much more intimate and much more human. But you'd look silly. You just can't. You could try it. Try it at the office tomorrow. You just can't pull it off. That's actually weird. I'm afraid I think of God like that. It just doesn't work anymore. Yeah. But Nietzsche's great sort of prophecy really was that was a massive problem for the westernized world, because our moral code was all based on belief that we didn't have anymore. And he said that whole moral code will break down. It basically is saying, look, we've built the house of Western morality on the foundations that we simply don't believe in anymore. And he said that will start to break down. And I think that prophecy has been spookily accurate, that you've got this increasing breakdown. Yeah, we're sort of living. We've been living off the kind of fossil virtue of the Judeo-Christian Judeo-Christian tradition all of this time. And what that appears in a society is all kinds of mores. In other words, sort of ways of being and living together, so we can work together as a society. All societies have had that, mores that help them be together as a society, and then bounded traditionally by belief in God and so on. Everyone went to church. Most of you won't even have parents who did that. My father, I remember my father was, very anti-church by then. But we're not even anti-church anymore. We just it just not a big deal. We just lost that, yeah. But what you see is the destruction of mores, don't you? Like, I keep on noticing those big posters that say, be kind, and don't stare, and all that kind of stuff. So what you're trying to do now is replace these kind of cultural mores, which people don't even know they have, but which, in the old days you'd open a door for a woman and you'd let her step through first, and, in the old days you used to get off the tube before people got on. You can see that change. That's already gone, etc., etc. So you're breaking. What happens is, all of that moral kind of fossil virtue, as I call it, or other people have called it, breaks down, and then you replace that by bureaucratical rules and procedures, which everyone gets very moral about, whether you're fulfilling it or not. And that mushroomed, didn't it, in COVID? But you can see that what holds a society together is a belief in some transcendent meaning, which they can found their life on, which gives rise to goodness, which gives rise to a community. Yeah? So what we need is a new vision, I can't see another vision but a Buddhist vision, because it goes beyond the distinction between sacred and secular. It's not secular and it's not divine in the Christian sense or theological sense. It gives you the possibility of a new foundation of goodness, out of which you can build a new, more integral, more genuine moral code with all these mores and cultural ways of being. That's effectively what we're trying to do here at the London Buddhist Centre, and what Triratna Buddhist order and movement are trying to do, and hopefully what other Buddhist order and movements are trying to do, is create a new society in miniature with based on a transcendental vision that gives rise to a new kind of morality that is not written on posters everywhere, be kind, don't stare, etc., etc., but is something that you just find yourself participating in. Yeah? I was saying recently that what we're trying to do here is it's something analogous to an Italian hill town where, everyone knows each other, everyone gossips, you have your own football team, you've got your own, places of, you've got your own, everyone knows everywhere, and in the centre of it you've got the church with a steeple pointing up to heaven. Yeah? That's really what we're trying to do in a wholly new way. Instead of a steeple pointing up to heaven, we have at the centre of our little Italian hill town, you need to have the sacred right at the centre of it. You can't have a culture. The only way to create a culture is to have a sacred centre. What modern life mostly lacks is a sacred centre, and it's making everybody more and more divide from each other, more and more suspicious of each other, men suspicious of women, women suspicious of men, black people suspicious of white people, etc., etc. We'll break down into more and more kind of distrustful polarities because we haven't got something that goes beyond us all that you can unify us. Cultures survive if they have a very strong, visionary, transcendent, sacred meaning, which gives meaning to the whole of that culture and which is expressed in mores. Yeah? So that's really what we all need, and of course that won't happen unless we all make it happen. I can't make it happen, you individually can't, but we can together actually create a little new world in miniature here. And weirdly, you won't be able to change yourself without doing that. We conform so deeply to our environment. I've just been on holiday with my sweary brother, as I call him. He looks just like me, but he swears a lot more. So if you see this guy on YouTube and he's swearing a lot, it'll be my brother. Yeah? But I was a bit distressed to see, being with my family again, how I conform to that shape. He's much more... Anyway, well, let's not go there. But, you need to build a new world so that you conform in a better way. I was starting to conform in a less good way. And we're all like that. As soon as you're in the pub, you conform to what a pub asks of you. If you're a Buddhist centre, you sort of conform to that. You're trying to go beyond that, but that's what environments at best do, is they get you to conform to something that's really valuable, which even encourages you to go beyond conforming, which is what this place should be doing. And we do it imperfectly, but we'll do it better if you all take part in that, genuinely take part in that. We can't do it without all of us doing it. But you see, we'd need to have a wholly new vision based on the Buddha, giving rise to a new kind of expression of goodness, which creates a new kind of community, which then, what you want from that new community is it's opening in its more and more to more and more people. But it can only open to more and more people, which I really hope it will do, if it has a very strong sacred centre, which many, many people, if not everyone, is quite strongly in touch with. That's really what you get on retreat, is you feel that Italian hill town. I must go to one. And they do such good ice cream. Never mind everything else. So that's one vision then of goodness. But I sort of want to end with beauty. So I was saying that we need to find the sacred, which is a truth beyond what is sayable, beyond what is sellable, beyond what is commodified, which you never have. Like, it's weird, I feel that some moments I'm a Buddhist, even sometimes quite strongly, and the next moment I'm not much of a Buddhist, and sometimes not at all. Buddhism isn't really something you have. You're not like a Boy Scout or a Girl Guide. It's a shame we call ourselves Buddhists so easily in a certain sense, because it's not like that. One moment you are acting like a Buddhist, and the next moment you're not very much. Yeah? And we're all like that. Hopefully you've got more and more of us who are acting more like Buddhists more and more of the time. So you've got this vision of something sacred, which you can never have, never own, never sell, never market, but which is the source of meaning and value. That then creates a community, a way of being together, which we call goodness, which the world really severely needs, where we live with each other, with people very different from ourselves, who we share a common bond with and a common sense of the sacred, to use that language. And I think that then finds its finest expression in beauty, interestingly. The American novelist and essayist Marilyn Robinson, she said that, and she's a very committed Calvinist, interestingly, a very intelligent Calvinist. She's saying that, she says, beauty is a conversation between humankind and reality, which is a beautiful way of putting it. Beauty is a conversation between humankind and reality. So beauty is like a bridge between who you are now and, to use our language, Buddhahood itself. It's a path of beauty. The more in touch you are with truth in this sacred sense, in some sort of transcendent and transcendental meaning to life, which you can never quite grasp or conceptualize, but you can be in touch with, even deeply in touch with, and you can live from, then that spills out almost into a natural kind of goodness, a new kind of goodness. And that is experienced by others as beauty, as a kind of beauty, a sort of beauty of virtue, a beauty of being. In a certain sense, it's all for beauty. And of course, the important thing about beauty is it's useless. As soon as you try and make beauty useful, you destroy it. So one way of thinking about, as it were, a glimpse of the goal is you can have a glimpse of formless beauty. So, particularly in meditation, but you can also experience this outside of meditation, you see things, you seem to see things as they really are. You have a direct realization, as it's usually put, of how things really are, which is beyond words, beyond space and time, beyond subject and object, beyond me and you. You have a sort of wordless vision of how things really are, and that's the highest expression of that is the Buddha's vision, where he saw how things really are, and that wasn't something he worked out with thought. It wasn't something he thought about. He just saw it. The metaphor of wisdom is also always to do with seeing. So you see things how they really are, and as you express that, it's experience of beauty. But it has this realization dimension, but it has this emotional dimension when you see things as they really are, even if it's just a tiny glimpse of how things really are. The emotional experience of that is one of great beauty, of a kind of formless beauty. You experience it as being almost infinitely beautiful. It is both true and beautiful. And you can see how people have felt they've seen that in the natural world, that uses infinite beauty. It's like the same principle at a different level, is that you see a world which seems like, I've just come back from Cornwall, which I have this weird sort of love for now. I just had a tiny moment looking at the waves, where I seemed to see a world in a tiny moment that was infinitely beautiful, complex, but also patterned, not chaotic. You can see where you end up with the idea of a creator, but there's no creator. It seems to have a sort of pattern. It seems to have a certain sort of intrinsic meaning and value, and so on. So the experience is both a direct realization of things, which is a seeing of things, but the emotional equivalent to that in the experience is one of great beauty. So recently I went to Florence with a group of guys from here. A friend of mine, Talib, I don't know whether you're watching, Talib. We went to look at Michelangelo's David in the academia there. Incredible thing. However many photographs you've seen of it, you have to go and actually see it. You have to go and do a pilgrimage and see it. and it was packed, and everyone just takes a photograph and goes. So you can get to see it pretty easily. But Taleb, Taleb comes from Uzbekistan. He's not an arty person, but I thought his sense of it was brilliant. He said to me, "It's like watching someone about to take a free kick." Now, which doesn't seem so penetrating after all. Now I say it, but and I have almost no experience of such a thing called a free kick, as you can imagine. But as he talked to me about this experience of seeing it, and what struck me about that as I looked at the David, what David is caught in that moment is in the moment. The thing about a free kick, excuse me, I can't believe I'm talking about this. The thing about a free kick is there you are, you're the guy in that moment. Everybody is watching you. There's all this pressure, and you're the guy who does that. It's that moment. All of our life is that moment, really. Every moment is that moment, because as I said at the start, it's going to end. So really we should be in that moment all the time. And the only person who is like that is the Buddha. But you see what I mean? This moment of a free kick is, can you take up that moment, or do you get distracted by all this pressure? Do you recoil back, or do you get rather heroic about yourself, or do you just step into the moment? And his description of it, for me, lit up again the beauty of David as a capturing of that moment where this is your moment of life. This is when your life takes place. Yeah. And as I looked at the figure, and as we all looked at David, you get this incredible experience of David's beauty, his physical beauty, the incredible beauty. It has a sort of aura. So if you can imagine that a seeing of the nature of things is not an abstract kind of, I kind of get it. It's not an abstract thing. There is this realization, there's a direct seeing, but the experience of it is like being in touch with David. It's like being in touch with the greatest beauty, which glows and makes everything beautiful. Yeah. So I think that's a good response to the future path, is to take up that ancient challenge of, first of all, truth, a sacred truth, expressing that in goodness, a new vision of goodness, which creates a new community. And by practicing intensively and by taking our lives properly serious, but in the genuine way, not in the portentous, silly way, taking our life properly seriously, so we experience this kind of formless beauty, which is how things really are.